I am going to start a timer so that I can kind of keep on time, because I know there's a clock on there, but there's nothing up on the wall to look at and everything. So thanks so much. Kelly went over a couple of the things that we just were going to go over, which just kind of talks about the masks and going through the app to ask questions. I may try and bounce over and see if there's questions that come through the session in kind of real time, but at the end I'll click over there and kind of read through and see what questions might have come through. As she mentioned, or I don't know if she mentioned this, that we are live streamed, so we will have questions both from in the room as well as live stream. So we're live stream and all sessions are taped, and so in a couple weeks they'll be available on, I think it's HDSA's YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch. Let's see. I think that was kind of some of our housekeeping. She read through kind of the goal of the session today. I'll start out with a little bit of definitions of dementia, so we're kind of all on the same page on what dementia is. Review some of the behaviors that are common with dementia, and then kind of that relation to HD and how HD may be similar as well as a little bit different. And then strategies to manage dementia behaviors, as well as recognizing caregiver burnout and managing caregiver burnout. So let's start with a definition of dementia, and I like this one specifically for a couple reasons. It says dementia refers to the destruction of brain cells and the pathways that join them as a result of the disease process. So it's a destruction of brain cells. There are brain cells that are not functioning. Symptoms of dementia are related to the consequences of having areas of the brain that are no longer functioning. I like that view of kind of that there are dementia symptoms, and they're a result of these brain cells or these brain processes not functioning. It's not as a result of someone trying to be difficult or someone being in denial or things like that. There really are parts of the brain, the pathways that just are not functioning, and then it comes out in the behaviors that we see that sometimes are really difficult to manage. There are different forms of dementia. Dementia is that umbrella term that is used for things like Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies, Parkinson's with dementia. There's cerebrovascular disease, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia. So all of these terms are dementia. Alzheimer's is the most well-known one, and so a lot of times we think of Alzheimer's and dementia as being separate, but Alzheimer's is actually under that umbrella term of dementia. And so depending on where the dementia affects the brain, we see some kind of common areas in some of those. With Alzheimer's, the short-term memory is one of the primary areas that is affected. With a Lewy bodies dementia, the hallucinations are kind of characteristic of that type of dementia. With vascular dementia, that is actually little strokes happening in the brain, and so depending on where those little strokes are happening, that's going to affect those brain cells. So it can manifest in a lot of different ways. With Parkinson's, we see it mostly in movements and then other areas. And then Huntington's disease has that organizing and filtering info because it's down in the caudate. I think I pronounced that right. I'm not the neuroscientist like we heard this morning, so it'll be a little more layman's terms. But that's that pathway that connects to our frontal lobe. And so with Huntington's disease, those pathways are severed. So a lot of that organizing information and kind of filtering information and that communication is what gets affected. All of these are progressive diseases. And so we go through different phases with dementia, and things get increasingly difficult as more and more brain cells are affected and more pathways are no longer functioning. So I'm hoping too that, when you're working with a loved one or when you're a caregiver that has a loved one with dementia, if we think about sometimes it's hard to step into their shoes because our brains are firing on all levels. Our brains are functioning appropriately and accurately, and so we're processing information appropriately and accurately. But with a loved one with dementia, there is so much that is not quite processing accurately. And sometimes there's an awareness of that, sometimes there's not an awareness of that, but they feel like something's off, and it can be really hard for them to get a foundation under them. It can be really hard to kind of get their footing because everything just seems slightly off. And so there's a lot of worries involved in that. There's a lot of fears. There's a lot of anxieties that can be involved in all of that when we're kind of searching for that foundation. But those psychological factors and the processes of our brain that give us that foundation, those aren't even functioning. And so then it's hard to get that footing. So I'm going to go through some different behaviors that are common with dementia. We talk a lot about learning and memory. I mentioned with Alzheimer's, short-term memory is one of those key components. Learning is actually that ability to acquire new information. We hear the information and we learn it, and then we have it. We also might change the information. Like we've learned something before and then we hear some more information about it. And so we change what we've learned based on like maybe a more deeper understanding, or we've learned it in a more full capacity with more information that's coming in. And then memory is that ability to recall that previous information that we've learned. There's different types of memory. And one of the examples I give when we go through these different types is, say you have a brother and your brother calls you up. Your immediate memory allows you to be talking to your brother. You understand his voice, you know that's what you're doing. You can have a back and forth conversation. You know what statement he just said, you can respond appropriately to that. That's your immediate memory at work. There's then your short-term memory. So later that evening, maybe the next day, your wife says, "Hey, did you talk to your brother yesterday?" You can't quite remember if you talked. I think so, but I'm not sure. Or nope, I didn't talk to him yesterday. That's the short-term memory. And so then there's also that long-term memory, and the long-term memory is talking to your brother in London, and he's lived in London for 10 years, and you remember he lives in London. This last year, maybe he moved to Atlanta. And when he calls you up, you ask how the weather in London is, because your long-term memory knows that he lives in London, but your short-term memory doesn't know that he's moved. And so you've retained where he used to live in your long-term memory. Your emotional memory, we see that emotions make stronger memories. So when your brother calls you up and says, "I'm going to be a dad for the first time, and you're going to be an uncle for the first time," you might remember that conversation, even though some of the things around that time period you may not remember, because there's an emotional connection to that memory, and so that actually solidifies memories more for us. There's also then a procedural memory that can be in a repetitive sense. It can be remembering things that happen the same all the time. It also, I like to think of the procedural memory as something that you remember because emotions and how you feel is so strong that when somebody, whether it's a caregiver, a loved one, when they approach you, how do they make you feel? So every time you talk to your brother, every time you hear his voice, that's a positive thing. You have a positive association with it. With people with dementia, they may lose that ability to recognize who their brother is, but they still know that that presence is a positive presence, and they can still feel comfort with that presence, even though they don't quite know who he is. And that's part of that procedural memory and the emotional kind of coming together. And so I talk with caregivers a lot in different facilities about their approach. I have the joy of sitting with people and talking with them and not making them change their clothes or not making them have to go to the bathroom or get a shower or things like that. And so they normally don't react super strongly to me. But with caregivers in facilities, in memory care and working with people with dementia, you need to change for the day. And sometimes that's not something you want to do because it's cold when you get out of your clothes or things like that. And so if a caregiver comes in and every morning that caregiver is making you change, you may start reacting to that caregiver because you know what's coming. And so you've had this procedural memory of like, when they come, I get cold. And that's the memory that's the brain process that's happening. And so you're not necessarily trying to react to that caregiver. It's not that you necessarily don't like them, but whatever is happening, you don't like that, and so you associate it with them. So I talk a lot with caregivers about how they come in and greet people and making sure that your tone and body language and all of that is really positive, because if you're just coming in and starting off on a task or something like that, then it can actually start to create some behaviors where they're more resistant and everything. So a little bit about memory. Insight is another behavior that's really common. Insight is the capacity to gain an accurate or a deeper understanding of a person or a thing. And we find that when people retain more insight, when they have more insight into some of the difficulties that they're having, when they have more insight into the fact that they can't remember things or that they can't complete tasks as well, that actually equals more frustration and can lead to more depression or anxiety, things like that, because they're aware of the shortcomings. They're aware of what they're not doing correctly, or they're aware that they can't do it as well as they used to be able to. If somebody has less insight, that's when the finger pointing happens. They don't have the insight into their own capabilities or their own abilities, and so then it's your problem. It's why you did that. It's why wasn't this done correctly? It's because you forgot, rather than something that is reflective on them. And again, these are really the brain processes that they're not trying to be difficult, or they're not, in denial necessarily, but it's really that lack of insight that is happening in the brain, and just not being able to have that process that goes, oh, okay, I actually probably can't drive a car anymore because I'm not going to know how to get to point A to point B. I've always gone to church. I've always gone to the store. It's fine. And I'm not recognizing that I actually don't know even how, okay, do I turn the car on first? Do I put my foot on the brake? What do I do first? All of those processes in order to drive a car are all affected. And when you lack the insight in knowing that all those processes are affected, then it's like, well, you're just taking the keys from me. You're just, you're making this difficult. I can do this. And so the more insight leads more to frustration, and then can be more fears or just more depression because they recognize that I can't do what I used to do. And then on the flip side, less insight is more of that pointing fingers that happens. Let's see. So judgment. Judgment is kind of a big one as well. And all of these, you can see as we go through this, will relate together. And all of these kind of play off each other because our brain is really complex. And our brain does a lot of things and a lot of processing in order just to do simple tasks. So judgment is the ability to make considered decisions or come to sensible conclusions. So we need a lot of different cognitive skills in order to make good judgments. Some of my examples I have here is kind of buying a car. If you're going to buy a car, you need to know what your budget is. You need to know maybe what years of cars you're looking at. You need to know, is gas mileage important? Where am I going to be driving this car? Am I going to need to have it go more off-road or not? Am I going to need to carry anything in this car, whether that's people or luggage, or, what is the transportation need? What color do I like? What type of features do I like? What's important to me? All of these aspects go into buying a car. So you have to not only evaluate each of those aspects individually, but you also have to hold all of those in your mind at the same time. If you went to a lot and said, I need a car with the best gas mileage, they would give you car A. If you went to a lot and said, you know what, I have a small business and I need a car that I can fit probably at least 6 to 8 boxes in, about, this size, they would give you car B. If you went into a lot and said, you know what, I have a cabin, so I need a car that's going to be good on some dirt roads at times, they would give you car C. But what if you want something that's a combination of all of those and kind of the best bang for your buck with all of those? You have to have all of those in your brain at the same time to make the best judgment, to make the best decision. And so we find that sometimes financial troubles or just inappropriate buying happens a lot with individuals with dementia, because it's, oh, I need this to solve whatever problem I have. I'm going to go click and buy it without the consideration of budget, without the consideration of if you actually need it or not, without the consideration of if there was something else that you already had, because you might have forgotten that you actually already had that thing in the garage. And so this is your third one in the last 3 months that you've bought. So that's kind of a bigger example, but even with deciding what to wear for the day, that can be really difficult and really complex at times too. You not only have to think about, okay, is this clean or is this not clean? Because sometimes if we don't keep that organized, it can be, you never know where you're pulling from. What is the weather going to be like today? What are the activities that I'm doing today? Okay, let me check the calendar. Okay, I've got the calendar. Okay, this is what I'm doing. Okay, but what is actually appropriate to wear for that activity even? And again, not everybody will have difficulty with all of these different steps, but because dementia affects different parts of the brain, and because we don't always know when the next part of the brain gets affected, you may see a decrease in the abilities to get dressed for the day because of some of that evaluation and judgment, or some of that lack of short-term memory progressing, or things like that. So they go to the calendar, they walk back into their bedroom, and they pull out the drawer. They totally forget what was just on the calendar, and they're pulling out clothes. There's even a process, like what do you put on first when you put on clothes? And then what do you put on next? And then and how do you put on clothes? Like all of those take brain processes in order for us to put them in the right order and know exactly how do I put this shirt on and things like that. So I find that in the facilities that I work in a lot of the time, oversized clothes are really popular. Button-downs that can just come for caregivers to help button are really popular because they're easy to put on and off. Stretchy pants, all that stuff, it's really popular because it's easy and they don't have to remember how to snap their pants or how to button or things like that. And then it can also be easier for caregivers as well. Let's see. Oh, and the other point with judgment that I like to make is that disinhibition is common, and we see that a lot. It is not necessarily due to a personality change. All of a sudden, a person becomes way more fancy-free or things like that. It's really usually due to a lack of judgment and lack of insight, like those processes just not working correctly. And so they can't judge how their response is going to come across to somebody else. Is this the appropriate situation to have that response? Is this the appropriate way to say that? How is this going to make someone else feel? And when you don't have all of those different processes that are functioning correctly, you're bound to then say some things that might be inappropriate, or you're bound to do some things that might be inappropriate because you're not holding in your mind the context or how it's going to make somebody feel, or if there might be a better time later in order to do that. Let's see. So again, we've kind of been talking about this a little bit, but because all of these kind of can be complex functions, but our frontal lobe is where our complex functions happen. And HD specifically, which we'll talk a little bit more about, those pathways to our frontal lobe, those communications, that gets disorganized, that gets interrupted. So our thinking, our processing, our emotional management, emotional regulation, we kind of talked a little bit about how we accomplish a task like getting dressed in the morning, even things like cooking and following a recipe and remembering, where the recipe is, what the different items are, how you're supposed to put them in, all of that. It takes a lot of complexity to do that. Managing emotions and emotional control is also one of those things that really can kind of emotional control. We need to understand how we are feeling, maybe even why we're feeling that, the intensity of those feelings, as well as how our response will affect those around us. And so that kind of emotional control. So we see the lack of that emotional management or regulation because we don't have that insight. We maybe don't have the insight for us, or we don't have the insight into the context of the situation. I mentioned earlier kind of those psychological anchors, like that foundation. We often see individuals with dementia kind of going into more of a fight or flight response, that kind of reactionary, because they just can't get that foundation under them because things are just not making sense around them. So again, it's not as much due to personality changes we find, with changes in emotion, mood outbursts, things like that. There's oftentimes some underlying causes, or it's that lack of that complex functioning and processing in the brain that's making our emotional response be inappropriate to whatever the situation is. Loss of initiative and apathy, these are two ones, they're similar but different. Initiative refers to being able to start an activity or a conversation, and then apathy refers to lacking kind of that interest or curiosity or motivation. Again, not necessarily personality changes when somebody stops wanting to do something, but oftentimes it's they just don't really know where to start, because that initiative in their brain of like, oh, this is the first step. Or, okay, I want to do this, but I don't even actually remember what the first step is in order to complete this. So oftentimes for us, doing a lot of that planning and organizing for them, which we'll get into when we talk about strategies, is important, because people can then still be engaging in activities that they really enjoy, but we have to do a lot of that processing and a lot of that planning for them, because their brain is not able to do that anymore. The other thing that I like to say about this is that the apathy, let me make sure I'm where I'm at. With apathy, we also need to decide, is this more distressful for me as the caregiver or as the family member, or is it distressful to the individual? I have a woman in a facility that loves to sit and just look out the window, and that's what she loves to do. And for a while there, people kept trying to get her into activities, get her into, but it was actually more distressing for her. And people are like, well, she just sits all day long and looks out the window. That's, what, but she's perfectly happy. She loves you to sit next to her. She loves you to hold her hand. She just loves sitting in silence and looking out the window, and it's her favorite place to be. So we also need to recognize that when potentially apathy or this lack of interest is more about us and more about our discomfort with the individual's lack than it is about their discomfort or their distress. So that's where some of that assessment comes in of like, what are they saying they want to do, and being able to then provide that for them. Changes in physical abilities, typically it always begins with fine motor. You're not able to do things as well. Fine motor is, the fingers and dexterity. Sometimes it's writing. It's just other intricate tasks. And but muscle strength and coordination also get affected. As we age in general, our balance is affected. And with dementia, then balance and that coordination is affected. So when we are looking at all of these symptoms and these things that kind of again, are symptoms because of the brain not functioning correctly, we want to look at the fact that HD affects getting that information in, like we said, that listening. So we're listening and we're processing and we're understanding. We may understand each word that's coming to us, but then trying to kind of formulate what our response is, putting the words together, and then getting it out in an appropriate way. Those are all things that get affected with HD. And then so that getting everything in and kind of getting it all processed in our mind and getting it all figured out, and then being able to communicate and express that language, those basically pathways are really one of the primary things that affects HD, which then, as you can see, that kind of affects all of those different brain functionings. I like to show this chart, and I use Alzheimer's disease because it is the most prominent form of dementia. There's a lot of things that are kind of similar, but a couple things that are different. You can see as you look down the Huntington's disease panel that a lot of the understanding, the understanding of language, the understanding of what's being said, it's all just a lot slower, but it's accurate. Whereas when we look at Alzheimer's disease, I have patients with Alzheimer's that will talk and they'll just say, oh, are you going to go get a cup of, I don't know, are you gonna go get a cup of that cracker? Like they'll say the wrong word instead of actually saying the correct word. And then the memory, things like that, Alzheimer's disease, individuals will stop recognizing certain things. They'll stop recognizing people. They will kind of stop recognizing really a lot of the day-to-day. They'll get less oriented around them, whereas an individual with Huntington's disease maintains that orientation around them. One of the main things with this difference is kind of an example of like putting on shoes. That's a person with Alzheimer's will still retain the ability to put on their shoes. They know that, okay, I take my shoe, I untie it, I put it on my foot, I tie it up, and here's how I do it. Whereas someone with Huntington's disease, they can tell you the steps of tying the shoes, but being able to put those steps in order and being able to kind of follow those steps, that a lot of the times will get disrupted. So I want to also talk, because I know that strong feelings and outbursts, mood management, we talked a little bit about that earlier. Mild annoyances can be expressed as strong feelings all the time. There's oftentimes a confusion, there's just a little frustration. There may be light coming in the window that is frustrating them, but not really knowing how to stop that light. And so they're just trying to get away from the light, and really it's just needing to close the blinds. But there's not either a memory of that, there's not either an understanding or a lack of initiative, being able to understand, okay, I need to get up and go and close the blinds, and that will stop the light from being in my eyes. So oftentimes, as they continue to be frustrated by this light in their eyes, then a caregiver comes up, somebody comes up to, and they kind of lash out at them. And it's really the underlying thing is that frustration with the light coming into their eyes. Sometimes it can just be confusion. If you or I, sometimes when we're getting confused and things around us kind of just don't seem like, we're just like, it's more stressful for us. And so when you can imagine if your brain is not firing on all ends, or if there's things that you're not quite able to reason with, then that can make your confusion, that can make your stress levels go way up, and then all of a sudden there's something that kind of tips that over. And because we don't have this ability to kind of control those emotional outbursts or that emotional regulation, then it comes out in that outburst. And the other thing that I like to point out here is, if I know that there's something I'm not that great at and somebody points it out, it can make me even more frustrated. And some of that comes in with the insight. And so recognizing, we always want to be helpful and we want to point things out in love, but just that recognition of, I know that my memory's not working very well. And then when somebody tries to help me remember, it just emphasizes for me that that's not functioning. And so I can just get really upset over and it's not even at the person that's trying to help. We know they're trying to help. But it's my own frustration with knowing that I'm lacking this ability that I really wish I still had, or I'm wanting to still have. So let's talk a little bit about, let me just go before we go here. I'm just going to do my click over real fast and just see if anything came through. Okay. So a question came through about, how do you determine if someone's apathy in mid-stage should be addressed? For instance, if they are saying they are content sitting watching TV, but you want to encourage activity. That's a good question. So, in general, with individuals with dementia and within Huntington's disease, I look for different signs of distress. Again, if they're really content, if they're not showing any signs of distress, if they're not showing any desires to go do something, with the apathy, it's really that, again, it's that lack of desire, but there also could be a lack of initiative happening in there too. And so if you're presenting hey, I'm going to go to this art show. Would you like to come with me? There might be this, no, but say, hey, I was looking at this art show, and like look at it with them. If they show some interest in what you're looking at, then you can say, hey, let's go tomorrow, or, so you can engage with them kind of on some of the other aspects of whatever you're wanting them to be involved in, and see if there's some things that spark some interest there. If there's some things that spark some interest in some of those other ways, then you can start to put into process to do it. If there's really not a lot of interest shown in that, and they're kind of content, then again, I would look at, okay, is this a problem for the individual, or is this a problem for me? Within dementia care, we've talked a lot about how it's not necessarily personality changes, but it's really the brain changes that are affecting it. And so some of the key things too is how much did they used to like whatever activity it was, if they used to really like going fishing. And then I'd look at, and this is kind of a little jumping ahead a little bit, but I'd look at, okay, if they really liked going fishing and now they're just really not wanting to go fishing anymore, is it that they're not quite sure they're going to be able to? Is it that they're not quite sure? Do they have enough insight to go, well, I don't even know if I'm going to be able to get in and out of the boat? Or do they have an idea of somebody that they always used to go fishing with? And so they have this memory of like, that's super positive. Well, that person's not available anymore. And so it's kind of like, I don't want to, this was always what we did. And this was the routine that we did. And so now that there's a new routine, I'm not sure I'm as interested in doing that. Is it that they'd like to go fishing, but they don't even know where to start or where to, so looking at kind of that bigger picture and kind of trying to assess for some of those other components can kind of help. Hopefully you see kind of where they might be at. So, whoops. Sorry, let me make sure I'm going back to the right screen. Okay, did that work? Yes, okay. So when we talk about strategies to manage dementia, there's a lot. Again, I am not comprehensive. So much of managing dementia behaviors are really trial and error. And when something works for a while, because dementia and HD, because they're progressive, something may work for a while and then it's like, ugh, this is not quite working anymore. So it's important to kind of figure out some of the whys it's not working, because it could be just a minimal shift in order to make it still continue to work for you. Because so many of the behaviors and the things with dementia are complex concepts and directions, we need to really break them down, trying to do this without talking down to the individual, and so recognizing what strengths they do have, what abilities they still maintain. Sorry, I'm just going to check my time. Okay. So, for example, we have a woman that every single year, she always bakes the birthday cake for the family. Like for anybody's birthday, she's the cake baker and she does it. Well, because of dementia, she's having difficulties with making the cake, and she's maybe putting wrong ingredients in, or she's not doing the right processes, and so it's not turning out. So one thing that you can think to do is having somebody assigned to kind of do the cake with her every year and take her lead, but be helping by, okay, tell me what it says next. Oh, it says salt. Okay, let me grab the salt and put out, So you're there kind of being her organized brain so she can still do the tasks, but you're helping her. And so it still gives her the ability to make the cake for the family every year, but you have somebody kind of assigned to her. A lot of the times that type of strategy of assigning somebody to the individual when you're at big family gatherings or other types of things is helpful. We'll talk a little bit later about kind of recognizing signs of anxiety and recognizing when there's some signs of distress happening. And so oftentimes having somebody that's kind of paying just a little more attention can help to then, hey, let's go drive and we got to go pick this one thing up at the store to kind of leave the family gathering because they just need a little bit of a break from all the stimulation that's going on. Another example, kind of doing laundry. Someone's always been able to do laundry. Now they're having more difficulty with that. You can create more baskets with labels. Some people will do cues, so set timers in order to make sure you remember to check the laundry. Because sometimes with individuals with dementia, even though the washer goes off, they don't remember what that's supposed to signal necessarily. And so there can be putting the laundry basket in a walkway or something like that so that when you have to walk by it, you remember, why is this laundry basket there? Oh, okay, it's here because I'm doing laundry. So there's kind of just a reminder, a visual reminder with that. Predetermined soap, getting little pods rather than trying to measure out soap, little things like that can make a big difference because it can allow, and then having kind of laundry steps and things like that, it can allow a person to retain that ability to do laundry longer when you take, basically if you think about it, when you take the organizing of the steps and when you take the how to complete the steps out from them. So you put on the directions or you change things out so that it's a really easy, there's not having to measure, there's not having to do anything like that. Repetitive chores can be really a wonderful thing. Somebody with dementia raking leaves, something that is repetitive in nature, can be really good chores. Wiping countertops off, even if you've maybe just wiped them, if they have a rag in the corner and they know that that's their job to wipe the countertops, they may walk by and every time they see that rag, they know they're going to wipe the countertops off. They might wipe the countertops off 5 times between lunch and dinner that they are not really needed, but there's that sense of purpose, that sense of usefulness that's their job. When you are, and this kind of goes, a lot of these kind of, with the slowing down, with checklists, written reminders, things like that, simplifying concepts, they kind of go together a little bit. But, providing a clear direction and a clear job. If I say, hey, can you go set the table for me? Okay, what do we need on the table? Where do I find it? Where do I put it? What should I do first? What does all that mean? Hey, here's forks. Will you please put these by each chair for me? That's a very clear direction. Grab the forks, put them on there. Great. Here's the plates. Can you go put these next to each fork? So doing that step by step, it's giving still that ability for them to be helpful and useful, but you again are doing the organizing, you're doing the assigning, you're really doing all of those other steps for the individual so that their brain that's not functioning correctly does not have to organize all of those steps themselves. So you're taking that on yourself. I think it's really important also to recognize which abilities they're able to retain. So somebody that always used to bake the cake and now they're not able to bake the cake anymore, instead of just taking that away from them, they're not able to, they put salt instead of sugar, whatever it might be, instead of just saying, hey, we're not gonna, I'm gonna do the cake this year. That can kind of be really a sign for that person, they don't want me to do the cake this year. I really messed up last time. That can be really hard. And so when you recognize they can still do the mixer, they can still put, they can measure, they can still help with a lot of that as long as they have somebody helping to organize it, helps to maintain that functionality, and it doesn't take something away prematurely. So really recognizing what somebody can do and what somebody's abilities continue to be able to do, and kind of looking at it from that strengths-based perspective can really help out with just having a better balance with some of that. Slow down is in all capitals. Slowing down is really important. Taking time, again, keeping ourselves in check of what our timeline is and allowing the person to process, allowing the person to be able to have a response. When we don't slow down, we oftentimes then assume that a person doesn't have a preference or doesn't have a response, when in reality they do if we just gave them a little more time to respond. 1 to 2 steps, yes or no, this or that. When we talk about visual reminders, hey, would you like this drink or this drink? Hold them up. I want that one. What would you like to drink? okay, what do I want to drink? What are the options? What do I want that? How, there's so much other processing to just what would you like to drink? What am I feeling like? Versus this one or this one. I have had people do like snack cards almost, kind of the side of the fridge and like the snacks that are on hand, and then you can point to snacks. I have had individuals, especially in the care facilities, they'll come up and they'll try and say, do you want chicken with meat sauce, or not chicken with meat sauce? Do you want chicken and pasta, or do you want meat sauce and pasta? And it's like, that takes so much. But then if they come and they bring both plates in front of them, the person can point to the plate that they want, the plate that looks the best to them. And so when you do this or that questions, yes or no questions, and then with the 1 to 2 steps, like we talked about, putting the forks on, then putting the plates on, then putting, that can be really, really helpful. The other thing too, there are people that, especially maintaining, like making phone calls, setting up appointments, things like that, a lot of the times just making a statement, slow down please, I have dementia. Kind of helping an individual get comfortable with saying that statement. The other end of the line is much more responsive. And so it is empowering also, and it can be scary to frequently identify the disease that is making it hard, but the more that there can be comfort with that, it can really ease a lot of conversations, because it changes the listener on the other end, and it helps them identify better how to work with you. Let's see. So the other thing too is when we talk about kind of, make sure I'm where I'm at here. So some of the things too is adding pictures next to phone numbers. So you have a list of their 4 kids. Well, let's put a picture next to each of those numbers, and then it's really easy to identify whose number that is. Picture, name, phone number. There you go. Popular phone numbers, things like that. Put the emblem of the business that is there, so that there's an easy, again, if we eliminate some of the complex processing, then we allow the person with dementia's brain to accurately do the rest of the processing, because we're taking a lot of the tasks for them. We tend to not like silence, and so we tend to interject a lot. And so if somebody's trying to focus on completing a task and somebody keeps talking to them, even if it's just like, oh, you're doing that really well, they have to stop that task, and their brain has to focus on, oh, they talked. Did they talk to me? They talked to me. What did they say? Am I supposed to respond? How am I supposed to respond? When in reality, they need, and then, okay, where was I at? What am I supposed to do next? And so when somebody, like we're planting flowers in a flower bed, and we are trying to have conversation as we're planting flowers, the flowers may get planted with the plastic things still on them, or something else, because they're trying to have conversation and not focusing on the steps of helping to plant flowers in a flower bed. But if they're working alongside you and are watching what you're doing, and you're doing it kind of in companionable silence, that helps their brain focus on the task at hand and what they're doing. And so I think that it's good for caregivers to really get comfortable with that silence, and understand that there is such a strength in that companionship. And it's okay to not necessarily have to interject all the time, because that then distracts our brain a lot. And distraction then can get really hard. Let's see. So a couple of the things at the bottom here, decreasing clutter for when balance and stuff becomes an issue. There are medication interventions for some dementia behaviors. Again, they're symptoms. And so when we think about them as symptoms, we know that there are medications that help with symptoms. They don't work all the time, and everybody is different, but there are some of those out there. Sleep hygiene and nutrition, nothing is going to reverse a progression, but the more stressed our body is, then the more stressed our brain is. So the more that we can have good and adequate sleep, going to bed at the same time, routine is really great for people with dementia. Again, we talked about how they can put their shoes on and everything. So the more routine that you can have, lay their clothes out every night the night before and then put them on the next morning. And doing that exactly the same each time is really helpful. So good sleep hygiene, if you need like a white noise machine or things like that to help kind of drown out other noise. And then just good, healthy nutrition. Again, a more stressed body then has a more stressed brain. Being aware of our own level of frustration, it's kind of in the middle there, I bounced over it, is also really important because when we get frustrated, individuals, they can still sense our body language. They can still sense our frustration. And so they might not know why, they might not even know what they're doing to cause that, but they know they're causing frustration, and then that can be anxiety producing for them as well. So we want to make sure that we're kind of recognizing our own level of frustration, and it's okay to walk away if you need to. Safety first. This is kind of just in general when there's those emotional outbursts, things like that. There's times that people, patients with dementia take a swing at people. Again, it's that lack of judgment. It's not actually trying to hurt somebody, and oftentimes they'll feel really bad afterwards. But it's a lack of judgment of they just need to, something is not, their foundation is not set, and so they just need to lash out because they don't know what else to do, because they don't have the words to say or so safety first. It's just more for you guys, and everybody's kind of different, as we want everybody to stay safe. And so there are some times that authorities might need to be called, especially if somebody with dementia is exhibiting a lot of really unsafe behaviors for them. And you've tried some tools and it's down to a safety concern, or there's unsafe behaviors towards you. And depending on the size of the person, that can be different for everybody. Let's see. I'm going to pop over really fast and just see if there's anything that's come up. Okay. Okay, making sure I've touched base on all of those. So we've kind of talked a little bit about a lot of these, but really strategies to manage dementia within is a variety of assessment tools for you as a caregiver. And I always tell caregivers and I always tell families that you are the expert in your loved one. You really are. You observe them all the time. You can observe signs and symptoms of things that they like, things that they don't like. You know their routines, you know their habits. And so you know them really well. And so if there is something that is causing kind of a problem, and I kind of talked about like the light earlier, I've had individuals that really get upset kind of around the same time of day every time. And it's like, okay, what is going on at this time of day that is causing like anxiety for the person? And so a lot of times it's taking that step back and looking at, okay, this behavior, how often does it happen? When is it occurring? Is there any sort of pattern that we can see? And it's been sometimes a shift change because they don't have as good of a relationship with a night staff caregiver or something, and so they get more anxious at that shift change. Sometimes it's even right before the shift change because it's the anticipation of it's going to be night and there's something different about night that doesn't feel as good to me as during the day. It can be the light that's in my eyes, but I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to change those blinds, and so I'm going to have an emotional reaction to that. I'm going to be extra frustrated when really it's just that light. So is it always when the light comes out from the trees? Is it at the same time where all of a sudden it's coming in their bedroom window? So recognizing sometimes the time, so going through those who, what, when, where, some of that things, and looking at that underlying emotion, because the anger and the outbursts are often, that first emotion is really a frustration or a confusion or something that's just not making sense. And so we need to fix that, and then we eliminate kind of the behavior. Again, we talked earlier, might take several times to find something that works. And then once you find something that works, it can then, it won't work then because things are progressive in nature. Consulting with other professionals, I always recommend for families that if you're having trouble with certain areas and you haven't had like a speech therapy eval or a swallow eval, or you haven't had an occupational therapy eval, things like that, do those kind of regularly. Like if you haven't had one for a year, it might be time to go and get another one, because those professionals have specific insights that they can provide you. Let's see. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about caregiver burnout. I know we're running at time, so I'll kind of go through this. You are a carer because you care. Caregiving is amazing. Like, caregivers are amazing, and it is all-encompassing. Like, you think about dementia and HD, and we've just gone through all these different processes that really are all-encompassing of all aspects of life. Your day-to-day life, to your life planning, to your budgeting, to your, everything is, we use so many complex functions. And so when those are not functioning correctly, it's all-encompassing. So as a caregiver, your care is all-encompassing. It's not just one thing that you have to care for, but you have to kind of hold all of this, and that's really a lot. So keeping in mind that you have emotions, it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay, because there are situations that are frustrated, and we can recognize that it's not in our control, but it's okay to be frustrated by it. Because something is just not working. So having trouble sleeping, too little, too much appetite, they're all kind of flip sides because everybody is unique and different. Having no energy, having lots of energy, having those hopeless feelings, things like that. All of those things can be related to caregiver burnout, and it's really important to recognize when you're feeling those things, when your patience is a little bit less, when you might be a little bit rougher in your cares, because your patience is wearing thin. Those are all signs of caregiver burnout. And recognizing that you also have a sadness and you also have a grief process. I do a lot of work with grief work, and I just want everybody to know grief is not just related to death, and that's a myth. Grief is related to a loss of function, a loss of identity, a loss of a role. Grief is really, and so there's grief for the individual with dementia, and there's also grief for caregivers and loved ones. And so recognizing those grief processes and embracing that there is grief and loss and steps with that, I think is just really important. I'm sure some of these you guys have heard a lot. It's the disease, not the person. We've talked a lot about how it's really the brain not functioning. And what we see coming out are symptoms of something not functioning. Prioritize, make lists, ask for and accept help. Ask for help. If it's really hard to ask for help, make a list of jobs that would be really helpful for somebody to do. And that might be a grocery store run. That might be, planting your flower. You love planting your flowers because you love seeing them throughout the year, but you just don't have the time to get out there and plant them. So maybe having somebody come and plant your flowers. Maybe having somebody just one meal a week might be super helpful on maybe a crazy busy night or a night or a day that you have more appointments than others or something. Making a list of jobs, so when people offer, you can say, this would be really great. People don't offer if they don't want to help. And so sometimes their help is not very helpful, which happens. So if you have a list of things that would be helpful for you, it can be your go-to. So, oh yes, this would be wonderful. Can you do that for me? Set boundaries, say no. Again, people don't understand. People that are not primary caregivers and have that 24/7, they don't always understand. They may mean well, but they often say things that are not really helpful, and they often say things that sometimes can be hurtful even too. If you have somebody that just doesn't really understand, it's okay to limit your time with them. It's okay to set that boundary to say, no, I don't really want to go to lunch or whatever it might be, because they will maybe talk to the person in a moment and get a lucid time or get a time where that conversation seemed. I have one gentleman with Alzheimer's. He is the happiest go luckiest gentleman, and he comes up to you, and I'm very close with this gentleman, so he knows me, but he doesn't know me. But he talks to me, we talk, and it's all great and everything, and he couldn't tell you who I am. He doesn't recognize that I'm actually part of the extended family. But, he just comes up and he just makes do with, he just talks to whoever. So somebody talking with him wouldn't recognize the day-to-day struggles that he has and the amount of things that the family around him do to help support him, because that one-time conversation, he was fine. He talked to me about the weather, and then he talked to me about this, and that was great. They don't see the whole picture. And so they're like, oh, what are you talking about? That's not that, they don't understand completely. So it's okay to kind of limit time with those people. I also make your health a priority. Take the time, look at caregiving resources. I think shared experience is really important. Coming here, participating in support groups, finding those that have that shared experience so that you can say something and they're like, yeah, I know. Like, oh yeah, we had this. Here's the example that helped us. That shared experience is super important, and I think just really beneficial. There's no perfect caregivers. We have impatience. We are frustrated. We have things that are going on that, make us to where we didn't get sleep last night. So now we're a little short. So give yourself grace. Give yourself, just be kind to yourself. Again, reframing losses, cherishing abilities. It's that kind of strengths. What can they still do? What is something that they can be helpful with? What's maybe a chore that they didn't used to do, but now they can, and you could help? Hey, I really need help with this. Could you please do this for me? And giving jobs to them that go along with their abilities. We talked about kind of that day-to-day, and I think the other thing too is, since you are in that day-to-day, you might not notice some small changes, and so then when others make comments when they haven't seen your loved one in 6 months or something like that, and they might say, wow, they seem to be really having a hard time with this, that can be a little feel accusatory towards you, like there's something you're not doing, or like there's not, but it's in reality, it's because that 6-month time period, there can be a lot of change. And so take it as insight from them rather than a judgment on you or something that you are doing or are not doing. And I just say that because I found caregivers. So I like this quote that I'll end with. It says, things turn out best for those who make the best of the way things turn out. There's a lot of this that is just not easy, and there's a lot of this that's hard, and it's hard in the day-to-day, and then it's hard because you keep trying something, and you might try 5 different things to get a correct schedule, and it's still not working quite right. But that's okay. Look and take a step back and reevaluate, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? What are some of the influences that are going in here? And then what are the abilities my loved one still has? And what are some of the joys that we still have? Or what are some of the interests that they still have that I can enhance and I can help support that? So let me double check and see. I know we're like right on time, but I'll see if there's any questions. Okay, I don't have any other questions that are coming through on the app. I'll be hanging out here after, but I think we're time now, if I have my timing right, because we started at 11. So thanks so much for coming, guys. Enjoy the rest of the convention.